So hello everybody and welcome to the final class. This class is a little bit different, first of all because it's completely online without the on-site portion of it, and also because I don't think I'll take a break. I'll just go all the way through, so I'm not sure if it'll be the entire time, but we'll see how it goes. Just as the reminder that the third and final test is coming up on Monday, April 17th, open between 7 and just before midnight. And as with the other tests, you take it on Canvas, slightly different format in that it's a bit longer, 25 questions, but the same multiple choice of format. You also have a bit longer to complete the test. That would be 60 minutes. And this is not a cumulative test, but rather just dealing with everything since the second test. So that would be session 9, 10, 11, and today's session, session 12. So be thinking about that, studying for the final test. So in today's class, I'm going to take us through the final topic, which brings us into the contemporary moment. And this, in some respects, is the most in process subject, since obviously when we're talking about the contemporary moment, we're talking about things that are still happening, still ongoing. So it's very difficult to form any kind of conclusive statement or assertion about current developing events. And it's also a little bit difficult to know what precisely to focus on, because you never know what might emerge as suddenly a very large subject in the near future. So this is just me choosing a couple of topics which touch upon different aspects of American socio-political culture in the contemporary moment, different just aspects of things that have been going on in American society recently. And as is usually the case with these lectures, this is far from being a comprehensive list. We'll talk about America and China. That touches upon questions of foreign policy, wealth inequality, which touches upon issues of economics, the digital revolution, which is a global phenomenon, but certainly something that is really worth focusing on in terms of what's happened over the last 20 years. And finally, American politics with Trump. So American and China, there you see two subjects to think about: refuting the end of history narrative and partners and rivals. If 9/11 swept away the end of history narrative, the rise of China into a global superpower has provided a case study for why this narrative was never true in the first place. And this picks up on an issue that I have mentioned previously, not just in this class, but in the British and European cultural history class. The idea that during the 1990s, there was this notion that democracy had been proven to be the only viable political system, and kind of on top of that, capitalism proven to be the only valid economic system. And there was this assumption that the two fit together, that in order to run a modern capitalist economy with all of the aspects of free trade and private markets, in order to do that, you need a democratic political system. Well, if 9/11 was the sort of event, the catastrophic event that called a halt to the triumphant veneer of the narrative, well, the rise of China has been the kind of long-sustained subsequent event that has basically proven that that thesis, that narrative is incorrect. Because China is clearly not running a modern democratic system, not as we would understand it. This is still very much a single-party state under the rule of the Communist Party of China. And that, of course, is very interesting when you put it into the context of the post-Cold War era, because the typical assumption is, wasn't communism supposed to be dead? Wasn't it supposed to have been killed off with the breakup of the Soviet Union, and prior to that, the fall of the Berlin Wall? Well, no, it's not dead. Not dead as an ideology, not dead as a political system. In fact, the Communist Party seems to have only tightened its grip over China and been instrumental to its very rapid rise over the last 20 years or so. Indeed, the elevation of China into this kind of global superpower is really one of the biggest events, if not the biggest event that has happened in the world over the past 20 years. China has effectively proven that it can run a market-driven capitalist system without democracy. But there's another side to that story as well. What is more, it is precisely the lack of democracy that seems to have made China a titan when it comes to manufacturing and exporting products such as clothing, footwear, electronics, precision instruments to, for instance, the United States. The story of China's rapid development is really the story of it turning into this export-driven nation state. There you can see a chart of different countries' share when it comes to exporting goods, meaning producing and manufacturing particular goods and then selling them abroad, selling them in other places. Well, you have a bunch of countries that are involved in this industry, but what stands out is that as of 2020, China is far in the lead percentage-wise. They account for almost 15% of the total global export of goods, and that's because China has been labeled, somewhat unfairly, but it has been labeled the factory of the world, meaning it's a place where they make everything. All these different products, all these different goods, ranging, as I say, from small consumer products to kind of big machinery. A lot of these things are being produced in China. The other side of that story, the notion that in order to run this kind of market socialism, as is typically called in China, totalitarianism, authoritarianism allows you to do that exceptionally well. It is, after all, the general denial of, say, workers' rights or low wages. Those are the things that allow China to flourish in this market. In a sense, America has kind of exported its own industrial manufacturing base to China. Less things are made in America, less in the way of electronics and clothing, because you can make them in China. And the reason they make them in China is not because people there are very adept at producing these products, but rather because they pay the workers a lot less. And they create conditions for workers that you could not create in a country like the United States. In America, for instance, you don't hear about building a giant manufacturing plant which includes dormitories, so you have your workers basically living on site where the factory is based. In America, people work at the factory and then they go home at the end of the day. And so too with a whole slew of other things such as labor rights, unions, strikes, all of those different things. The production and manufacturing base in China is flourishing in part due to this authoritarian control of workers, individual workers within China. So one of the kind of ironies is that America has lost a lot of its own manufacturing prowess, but it hasn't lost its consumption prowess. It still consumes and buys as many things as before, and a lot of these things are cheap and affordable precisely because they're being made overseas in a country like China. With the mass production that has come to China over the last 20 years, there has been an exponential increase in industrialization. And here is another story that is worth pausing over, the idea that we really haven't solved or even really dealt with productively the question of fossil fuels, petroleum extraction. I mean, we hear about the environment, climate change, and the rush towards new green energy sources. And these are measures that might be adopted in America and Europe to a degree. I mean, there certainly hasn't been a major large-scale transition, but this is, after all, a global phenomenon. When a country undergoes this rapid industrialized development, well, there you typically see an exponential increase in petroleum consumption, and that's certainly been the case in China. Since 1990 in particular, look at the skyrocketing amount of oil consumption in China. Oil is extracted in China itself, but China also imports petroleum as well. We go from roughly in the range of 2.5 million barrels of oil per day, up all the way close to 15 million in the year 2020. And this is really something that speaks to the global phenomenon of climate change, of fossil fuels being a finite commodity. Here you see that this exceeds far beyond the borders of just any individual country, because other countries become involved in the petroleum industry as they undergo these rapid movements towards mass industrialization and production. The story of the relationship between China and the United States is really a fascinating story, because there isn't really a sense of a Cold War between them right now, at least certainly not the degree to which there was between the Soviet Union and America in the latter half of the 20th century. But what actually is the nature of this relationship between the two countries? Well, suffice to say, China seems far removed from the days of the Cultural Revolution. That was a coordinated nationwide purge of reactionary elements in Chinese society. Since the late 1970s, China has made its economy by engaging with and importing capitalist economic ideas. And that really is where the transformation came from. I mean, you go back to the era of Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution. This was this kind of hardline revolutionary era that was hell-bent on purging anything that resembled capitalist or imperialist aspects from society or subversive foreign influences. But really, since the late 1970s, China has been working on its economy by engaging with precisely capitalist ideas, free market ideas. Those are the ideas that have kind of flowed into that country and have restructured, remade the country in a new image. And you see how this symbiotic, close-knit relationship between America and China is working today, this kind of flow and connection between them. You have ideas about a free market enterprise and capitalism flowing into China. Okay, from China, you have the construction of so-called market socialism. It manifests itself as this massive manufacturing industrial base that makes a whole bunch of different products, and those products flow from China into America. So you see that kind of exchange. Ideas one way, and then different consumer products the other way. But along with that, you also have money as well. In the process, China has stockpiled trillions of dollars in foreign currency reserves and currently holds 13% of the U.S. national debt. China, as of today, has by far the largest holdings of foreign currency in the world, and that's partly due to their own currency manipulation. That was a big part of the kind of Trump-China trade war that kind of developed over the course of Trump's administration. So you also have a whole lot of money flowing into China and this kind of reciprocal relationship between the two of them. So they certainly have become these partners on the global stage. They are participating in the further advancement, development of the modern capitalist system today. And you could say to a degree, America looks to this other country on the other side of the world to do the things that it cannot do anymore, such as severely underpaying its workers, such as preventing strikes or labor unions from forming. Also, such as bending or even breaking environmental rules and regulations, because those things are not actually being enforced in any stringent sense in China. So you have a lot more in the way of environmental pollutants and different practices that are contrary to the laws, regulations in America. So what does the future of this relationship hold? As I say, it's a symbiotic relationship, and yet there's a clear element of ongoing competition between them. The question is, what form will this competition take in the future? You can see that the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, has this kind of almost cult of personality forming around him. That's somewhat of a recent development, we could say. I say there, one of the big questions, is it a contest between competing ideologies or just competing states? The idea of China running this authoritarian government, well, that's one thing. But again, communist ideology, to what degree does that play a big part in China's self-definition as a nation state? Does it really oppose capitalism and democracy on principle? Well, this is kind of woven in to the ruling ideology of the nation state. The notion that China will lead this transition out of the capitalist system into a different system in the future, as Karl Marx imagined. Now, they don't seem eager to do that right now, but this is certainly part of the narrative that the Chinese government continues to develop up to the present day. The notion of competing against the Western states, competing against capitalist ideology, refuting foreign influences, subversive foreign influences. So there is that element of ideological competition between them, and that's the kind of unknown X factor that remains to be resolved, and who knows how that's actually going to play out in the future, because notwithstanding the partnership between America and China, there do seem to be these very different political visions from the two countries. And if nothing else, you'd have to say that the ruling Communist Party in China today represents that massive contradiction and refutation of any kind of idea of democracy being inevitable. Democracy being this just global tidal wave that is basically going to sweep over every single country and convert them into the same system. Clearly is not happening right now. So we talk about these issues and the death of this end of history idea. Well, we can talk for one thing about other nation states. It's not just China. You can point to any one of a number of wealthy nation states today that do not run full-fledged democratic systems. But the other story, and it flows the other way, is what has happened to American democracy over the last 30 years or so. What's the state of American democracy today in the 2020s? And it doesn't really seem to us as though China is moving slowly and inexorably towards embracing democracy. Rather, it almost looks as though America is moving slowly and inexorably towards embracing authoritarianism and totalitarianism. The decay, the decline of American democracy, that seems to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, political stories in the country as a whole over the past 3 decades. So let's take a closer look at precisely that dynamic and some of the different aspects within it. Begin with wealth inequality, which touches upon everything that happens in the United States when we start to speak about internal domestic issues. Growing inequality and the role of the American education system. I'm just focusing on that because that is one of those subjects that I would say lurks in the background, but often is not addressed directly. But there's a lot of other things we could talk about within the American system contributing to inequality. Growing inequality, which you can see today. I mean, we listen to the rhetoric from various American politicians. We listen to the competing visions, the competing ideals of the two ruling parties in America, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. But one thing that is obvious, that is painfully obvious, is that the United States as a whole has done nothing to redress the issues of a persistent wealth inequality within their borders. And the numbers, you only have to look at the numbers. There you see the chart at the top showing the distribution of wealth by assets among different groups in America. By far, the top 10%, the top wealthiest people in America, control the majority of the wealth. And you can see that from the chart. In fact, the top 0.1%, I mean, I'm not sure who all belongs to that class. Think of the multi-billionaires, all the people who are these corporate super managers, various individuals in the entertainment industry, politicians as well. Their wealth exceeds the entire bottom 50% within America, exceeds it by a lot. Yes, that's 0.1%. Chart at the bottom, this is courtesy, by the way, these graphs of the Federal Reserve in America. That would be the central bank of America, measuring wealth inequality in the United States. There you see the chart showing the percentage of wealth controlled by the top 10%. And what you can see is that their share has increased over time. You can see it in the range of, well, somewhere below 60% in 1990. Move forward, you see it creeping upwards, getting closer to 75% in the present day. Growing inequality in America. And again, we listen to the political rhetoric appealing to the middle class, talking about social justice, talking about equal rights. They have contributed nothing, done nothing to the hierarchical structure of contemporary American society, rigidly stratified. I mean, you talk about the social pyramids of the feudal order. Well, there's a lot more wealth rolling around today than there was in the medieval period, but this does look a lot like that pyramid, that narrow structure where you have the upper echelons at the very top controlling the majority of the wealth and power in society. This is split along racial lines and along gender lines as well. You can talk about regional lines as too. There you see wealth gaps in the U.S. that fall along racial lines. Percentage of the African American population in the U.S. versus percentage of African American wealth in the U.S. So this is proportionally speaking the percentage of people in America who are African American. It's not necessarily that their total numbers declined during this period. It's just that the American population as a whole increased. What you can see there is that since the civil rights era in the 1960s, there has been a basic stagnation in the percentage of wealth that Black Americans have. And you might note the numbers here, somewhere between 2 and 4%, far below the percentage of total people who fit within that particular demographic. So what accounts for this? I mean, there are so many different things that we can focus on, that we can point to. But I want to talk about the American education system, since, I mean, here we are in a university, so there is this self-reflexive dimension to it. But this is also worth noting as a phenomenon that is quite contemporary. I mean, there's always been this stratified aspect to the American education system, but it's getting worse. It's not getting better. There is not improvement in the availability, the accessibility, the fairness of education in America. No, it is getting worse over time steadily. The rigidly stratified American education system perpetuates wealth inequality. Absolutely. The American education system is one of the biggest proponents, one of the biggest propagators of inequality in that society today. Ladders to high income jobs pass through a feeder system of private brand name institutions, which charge with variations up to $85,000 a year. That's when you combine everything with tuition and other various costs. And obviously that kind of money is outside the range of a huge number of people who live in the United States, outside the range from the start. There might be a couple of whiz kids here and there who get into elite boarding schools in America, but they're just the exception that proves the rule. They don't make any real difference to the overall trend, the general trajectory, which is that family wealth and family connections are determinant factors in admission. I mean, they have to be, because you're talking about people, little kids who enter these school systems at a very young age. How are they entering into these school systems? Is it the incredible genius that they show at the age of 7 or 8, right, or whenever they enter? No, it's the money of their family and their family's connections. That's basically the determinant factor, and they send them along these carefully enclosed, manicured systems, enclosed, cloistered environments, which are specifically designed to wall out the overwhelming majority of people in America, these kinds of elite spaces. And as I say, they're not just ladders to particular schools or universities, but directly into specific high-income jobs, prestigious, money-making jobs and professions in America. As I say, a recent phenomenon as well, because this kind of feeder system into the upper echelons of America has been pervasive for a very long time. But how about this as something recent? Estimates indicate that in the past 40 years, American university tuition has increased by roughly 1,400%. So not 50%, not 100%, but in fact, 1,400% in terms of an overall increase. And we see that today with the astronomical tuition fees that American universities, and not just elite American universities, but a wide range of different American universities charge for people to attend their schools. No other industry, not even the unequal healthcare system, has seen such price hikes over time. And what new services are universities really providing to students in order to justify these costs? Well, there is the big question, right? I mean, you would think with a 1,400% increase over the course of 4 decades, that would mean that universities are providing a radically different type of education or a different kind of experience for their students. I mean, if healthcare costs increase that much, then you would assume you'd have a whole lot more technology, better medicine, better doctors, that people would be living a lot longer. Well, it actually is true to an extent of the healthcare system, but I would argue is not true with universities. The fact of the matter is the basic form of education that these universities are providing has not changed substantially over the past 40 years. Yes, now we have Canvas, right? And we have PowerPoint, and we have online courses and lectures, and we have a whole bunch of probably other bells and whistles that you can kind of layer on. But these things are all really just the kind of garnish that is piled on top of the basic experience, the basic process of knowledge acquisition, knowledge delivery, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's kind of like a major sporting event like the World Cup or the Super Bowl or something like that. You can have all of these different celebrities and ceremonies and a giant halftime show and all the hype and all the hoopla, but somewhere underneath it all, there still just is a football game, right? And it has to be a good game or the whole event is a bust. I think university education is similar. Somewhere underneath that all, there's still lectures for large classes like this one, or discussions, dialogues for smaller classes. I mean, that's still the heart of the education system. So this kind of exponential increase in the cost, I would argue, is not being paid out with a kind of tangible show of a parallel value. I mean, it's just sort of, yes, it's kind of the same experience in a lot of ways. So why? Why has this happened? Well, you can see the way the American education system has not only continued to reflect inequalities in American society, but in some ways has become more rigid as those inequalities become ever increasingly entrenched. At 38 of the top 100 universities in America, more students from the top 1% of US society will attend than from the bottom 60%. And we also have to take into account international students as well. There you see the Ivy League universities in America: Penn, Columbia, Harvard, Dartmouth, Yale, Cornell, Brown, Princeton. Well, they're very big on this idea of building international profiles and diversifying their student bodies, making their student bodies very cosmopolitan. Yeah, they're talking about rich students from abroad. They're not talking about international people like us, right? No, they mean wealthy people, well-connected people. That's basically another conduit for the outsized endowments that these institutions accumulate. In reflecting ever deeper inequalities in America, university education has devolved into a conduit for luxury brand names and status symbols. That, I think, is what accounts for the increases in tuition fees. It's not a change in the value of the education. It's the idea that the university education is kind of a status symbol, or this kind of luxury brand that becomes attached to a kind of small coterie of people. The admissions scandal, if you remember that occurred at some universities, I think Southern Cal was involved in that, is really a case in point, where you had the children of celebrities, and there was money that changed hands, and there were these dodgy admission processes, making it sound as though these people were student athletes when they were not. To what end? To what purpose? Well, just to get access to this brand name, to get access to this stamp, this seal, which, yes, provides a feeder, a ladder into the upper echelons of American society. University ranking systems, which have become more prominent today, like the QS rankings, for instance. Not sure if the University of Iceland is on that, but nonetheless, it's this kind of very sort of rigid list of the top universities in the world, which completely elides the unique reasons why universities might be different from one another, the different educational experiences that they might offer. No, it's just all this kind of hierarchical list. That's part of it. And also the fetishistic celebration of low admission rates, as low as 5% in some cases, play into this dynamic. Make no mistake, these universities, for instance, could admit many more students than they actually do. So why don't they? I mean, it wouldn't be some kind of disaster if they were admitting 10% of the people who apply to them. There are certainly a whole bunch of different individual students who are qualified to attend elite universities. No, it's this fetishization of this kind of idea of elite status and exclusivity. Exclusivity based on the notion of excluding huge numbers of people who are, in many cases, are actually qualified to attend. So the American education system, I would say, the kind of rush towards this luxury branding has really played directly into growing inequalities in American society. And with the development of this privatized model, well, you see the knock-on effect on a public education in America, which has been suffering continuously over the same period for the last 40 years. There you see in 1989, less than 32% of the nation's public school students were low income. Today, that number is 51%. In other words, public schools, publicly funded educational institutions are increasingly becoming the domain of low-income individuals, low-income families, and effectively locked out from the upper tiers of American society, locked out for their entire careers. As I said, there might be a couple of whiz kids here and there who sneak in, but it's not real accessibility. It's not real equality within the education system. Polls indicate that only about 25% of Americans have faith in the public education system, which is also a sharply declining number over time. There is this rush towards a kind of privatization and corporatization of American education, and thus consequently public schools, schools that are supposed to be designed for the benefit of the community, the benefit of society, suffer in turn. Next topic to consider here, the digital revolution, and here too is a subject that I brought up previously. This was main a focal point in the class, the British and European Cultural History class last semester, but I want to speak about it in relation to the United States in particular, since America really stands at the vanguard of digitization, and here are a couple of subjects we're going to go through: social media and the microcosm, the Facebook model, and the new/old individual. Since we're speaking about the American education system and this idea of exclusivity, well, Silicon Valley has become the setting of high-tech advancements in America, a place of innovation, wealth, and startup companies. And Silicon Valley exists in this kind of symbiotic relationship with Stanford University, shown there at the top, which is well known as this feeder system into prominent tech companies such as Google. So when we talk about the digital revolution, we're talking about a process that has the ability to be global, to completely transform human behavior, but there are also particular places, specific settings where digitization has really taken hold. And Silicon Valley is kind of the home of digitization today. Focus a little bit on the story of Facebook, because this provides us, I think, with a good snapshot, a kind of case study in the development of the digital revolution. You see Mark Zuckerberg, who launched Facebook from his Harvard dorm in 2004. And there were other social media companies that existed at the time. And of course, there was a big story too about Zuckerberg basically pilfering the idea. So it wasn't as though he kind of invented this concept. It was already present, but Facebook became its own unique thing. It evolved quickly from a diversion to a necessity within the narrow microcosm of the university, because initially it was actually confined to the university environment. It was targeted at Harvard students. providing a framework for autobiographical self-presentation and safe voyeurism. And that really became the business model for Facebook in its first years. This is the idea of social media. Autobiographical self-presentation. In other words, there's this opportunity to create this online profile, and it includes your photographs, and it includes information about yourself, and there is this opportunity to just introduce yourself online. It's almost the ultimate icebreaker in a way, and it became a very valuable tool for university students who were entering into college, a place where they might not know anybody, and think of the legwork that is involved in getting to know people, attending whatever meet and greets or whatever parties might exist. You have to keep introducing yourself. You have to keep talking about your various interests, your background, so on and so forth. Well, Facebook, it provides a kind of a quick, neat way to do that, where you just present a profile and you say, here, this is me. This is how I would present myself in a public setting. Safe voyeurism, because it's not just about the individual presenting themselves, it's also about spying on other people, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea of social media, if not stalking people in this kind of benign way, because you can look at people's various photographs, you can look at their interests, as the case might be with Facebook's future developments, you can see what they're doing right now as they continue to report, to check in. So there is definitely this voyeuristic element of entering into other people's lives, finding out what other people are up to right now without necessarily having to engage with them or spend a lot of time with them. The safe aspect of voyeurism was because it was contained within the university environment. I mean, at least initially, that was the kind of idea of why Facebook caught on originally, because people don't mind this voyeuristic dimension, but they want to have the impression that they're controlling who is looking at their profiles. It's kind of a little bit dodgy if it's just broad and uncontained and there's no sense of regulation. But if Facebook is just the Harvard community, well, there you go. You have this sense of a microcosm, a kind of controlled environment of sorts, and thus people just interact with each other within that space. That became the Facebook model long after it spilled past the campus of Harvard and became basically an international global phenomenon. People still have that impression about Facebook. Yes, I'm putting myself out there. Yes, I'm kind of putting my face and my information out there, but nonetheless, I'm still controlling my community. It's still kind of my version of the hive mind. There's still this sense of this gatekeeping of who enters and who is kept out. I mean, it's probably false, right, when you look at the data collection of social media companies, but that's basically the working model of Facebook and most social media companies. But with social media has come the phenomenon of digitization. And I would say that the digital revolution, here's another point I mentioned previously, the digital revolution began really in earnest in the mid-1990s with the advent of the internet, but it has accelerated with social media basically since the early 2000s, and we're now going to be entering a new phase with the development of artificial intelligence. So what do we really see when we focus on social media as this case study of digitization, and in particular in relation to America? Well, among other things, what we see is the tendency to instantaneously introduce things, to introduce new ideas, to introduce new features, and indeed to introduce new technology without really stopping to wonder about the consequences. This was part of the story when Zuckerberg was first setting up Facebook when he was at Harvard, because there was pushback from the university administration because he was basically creating this online student database. Of course, the authorities at a place like Harvard want to have control over it. They don't like the idea of an undergrad, a student, setting this up on his own. And there's this kind of university administration story of, oh, well, we'll figure out how we should best set up a student database. Let that be our job because we're the ones who are supposed to be controlling and regulating this. But Zuckerberg, as this kind of whiz programmer, which is what he was and is, he has this attitude of, I can just create this in the space of 2 weeks. I don't need to wait for the say-so from the university administration. I don't need to wait for any kind of social commentary on this or any kind of test subject or anything like that. Just introduce the thing and then it's set up. And this basically has become the model for Facebook and other social media companies. There's one example. There you see when Zuckerberg introduced the newsfeed feature back in 2006, which was a radical change to Facebook's format. Basically introduced this model where you are seeing what all of your Facebook friends are doing in real time. So if somebody creates a group, if somebody posts a photo, if somebody checks in somewhere, well, you see this in this kind of running stream, this feed. That was not the original model. It provoked tremendous outcry and even protests, as in people outside of Facebook's headquarters protesting about it when it was first introduced. And I think Zuckerberg was even forced to issue an apology about this reckless introduction of a new feature, but he did not scale it back. He did not return to the old Facebook model. Why would he leave newsfeed in place even though it seems as though everybody hated it when it was first introduced? Well, the reason he left it in place is because people were using it. In other words, the product didn't flop. People just use newsfeed to complain about newsfeed, right? They use it to kind of spout off or to air all their grievances, but they're still using it as a tool and an implement. And I would say that that became precisely that underlying subtext that I was talking about, introducing features and just letting people adapt to them, whether they like them or not, right? Whether they're actually good or not. There's a sense of, well, it doesn't matter because in the space of 2 weeks or a month, everyone's going to be using it anyway. So it doesn't even matter whether it is good or bad. The test subjects are the consumers, the users themselves. As I say, the immediate introduction of a feature has become a hallmark of social media companies and indeed digitization in general. And so too with the ongoing acceleration of the digital revolution, because now we're clearly entering a new stage of this. Social media has been the big story since the early 2000s, but now we're getting into the era of artificial intelligence, AI. And I saw recently, this is why this is worth talking about, recently Elon Musk, who I think was just recently replaced as the wealthiest person in the world, I guess he's down at number 2, and now was heading this petition which calls for a halt on AI development for 6 months, I think is the time frame that he mentioned. Here's one of his quotes: AI is far more dangerous than nukes, he says. And this petition points out that companies are not taking into account the risks involved in the technology that they are developing. Well, is Elon Musk right about that? Sort of, but not really in the way that he's saying it, right? I mean, it is dangerous, but it's dangerous in the sense that it's completely transformative. I mean, I've said this before. The digital revolution is or will be as big as the Industrial Revolution, as big as the Agricultural Revolution, which happened 10,000 years ago. Fundamental modification to human behavior. This will not be the same species at the end of the digital revolution, whatever that will be, right? Because, I mean, these things are still ongoing. This is a transition into a new era in our entire history. And who knows what's going to come of that? That's the era, that's the element of it being dangerous. Yes, it is dangerous, but just because it encompasses everything. So it might be tremendously beneficial, brilliant, fantastic in some respects, but horrible in some other respects. So that's the kind of unpredictability of it. The issue of such a petition touches upon intersections between technology, capitalist competition, and government oversight. As far as technology goes, as far as digitization goes, we have the impression right now of a giant tidal wave that is just sweeping us forward, and we're not really in control of it anymore. This, no doubt, has been the situation in previous moments in human history. When you talk about large-scale revolutions like the Industrial Revolution, it catches hold of people and starts pulling them forward, and ultimately no one is really in control of this rapid process of introducing ever more advanced, ever more sophisticated technology. But there is also capitalist competition. That's the other issue there, because you go back to Silicon Valley, well, that's what's happening there. You have all these people who come out of, say, the computer science program at Stanford, and they're all running their own business startups. They're all trying to develop the latest technology, and they're competing with one another, and that is part of what's fueling the exponential development of artificial intelligence. AI is clearly reaching new levels. We've seen it with AI being able to defeat human players, seemingly any human player at chess, at the strategy game Go. But I mean, it's bigger than that when we start talking about AI disrupting all sorts of different professions, taking hold or taking root in the labor industry in America, which is undoubtedly something that's going to happen in the future. So that's the kind of disruptive potential of AI, and the competition is heating up to develop that technology as quickly as possible. And government oversight, the thing with this petition, the idea that the US federal government would intervene immediately and call a halt to AI development, at least until they can develop workable laws, rules, and regulations for it. Well, on measure, that actually sounds like a fairly good idea, because no doubt there should be some kind of oversight or at least conversation about what is happening, but it kind of imagines a different version of the US government than the one that currently exists. I mean, you know, the US government today, the one that's deadlocked between these two competing political parties, the one that is so polarized and oppositional that every single issue that enters that government immediately becomes part of this partisan campaign. I mean, the US federal government just seems completely incompetent and inefficient when it comes to dealing with issues such as this, which basically means issues that involve some kind of unified viewpoint or single standpoint. And even if the American government were to do that, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that other countries would follow suit. China, for instance, country I mentioned before, is certainly working on its own version of artificial intelligence, and I'm not sure what kind of international tribunal we could dream up in short order that would actually regulate this process in some legal sense. I'm sure the United Nations could kind of dream up a charter or something like that, but it wouldn't really make a significant difference to the individual participating countries. So as of now, it's this kind of crisis of rapid technological development, the potential for massive disruption in short order, and the inability of a government's political systems to act on that in some sort of efficient or unified manner. When we look at some of the effects, well, we'd have to say that just the disruption of digitization has really already happened in earnest. We only have to look at this model of moving fast and breaking things, which is a motto from Facebook. If Zuckerberg's model has become this idea of just introducing new features and letting them play out on the public, well, you can see how that model has infiltrated the circulation of information in the United States, especially political information. This, I would say, is the working framework for modern political dialogue in America. There you see a bunch of Donald Trump's tweets, and you might note the date there, January 6th, 2021. That would be the day of the riot at the Capitol, and also basically ended his social media career, or I should say didn't end it, put a halt to it, because he did develop his own social media network, and I guess his Twitter account is also revived now. But one thing that stands out about this is not only all this stuff about the election and all of his different ideas and stories, but the sense of this kind of scattershot of stuff, which basically defined his social media persona. It's the impression of just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And this was, the basis of his attempt to overturn the election of 2020. You had stories about dead people voting. You had stories about ballot machines switching votes, ballot harvesting, suppression from big tech. I mean, whatever it might be. I mean, some of the stories might have had some validity to them. Others were complete bunk. But there's a sense it doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't matter what the facts might be, what the evidence might be. You just create all these different stories instantaneously, and you just introduce them as though they're true. And I would say that that has become the basic model for political dialogue and discourse today. You only have to look at the news stories that are propagated in short order. The idea that this is the story of the moment today, and whether the facts cohere with this story, whether it's based on anything, well, it doesn't matter, because tomorrow there will be a news story instead. It's the endless, rapid introduction of different narratives, different points of view, different kinds of dialogues, and different fabrications, in many cases without any appeal to either cohesion or, as I say, to the actual facts. The phenomenon of social media, of the social media identity, seems to have introduced new constructions and representations of individuality, but with it has come the tendency to view the individual as a conduit for advertising and consumption, mirroring the corporatized structure of these companies. Here we have this idea of what the digital revolution is actually doing to the typical common individual. I said this before. One thing that social media does is it allows for this self-presentation of the individual. This becomes a site where a person can post their photographs, can talk about their interests, can have this entire identity, a kind of constructed identity. And yet, when you look at the way social media actually operates, it basically is a vast advertising mechanism, a series of interconnected advertising mechanisms. And half the time, people are not necessarily posting about their own lives, but rather they are posting links to various news stories, or as the case might be, links to various products as well. The individual is not really this creative, innovative construct in the world of social media. Rather, the individual becomes this conformist participant in processes of advertising and consumption. Indeed, it's the flood of advertising into social media that now defines its workings. For a long time, a lot of social media companies, including Facebook, were not especially profitable. They might have had a lot in the way of credit, but they also had a lot in the way of startup costs as they were introducing this new technology. It's really the advent of advertising, the use of advertising on all these different platforms and sites, whether you're talking about Facebook or YouTube, for instance. There you see the kind of infiltration of advertising, and it's reshaped the individual as someone who kind of carries along different advertisements or is a consumer of different products that are being bought and sold online. Finally, the last subject to consider in this session, the Trump phenomenon, the election of Donald Trump. And here, of course, we don't really know how this is going to play out, because now we have an ongoing story with the recent indictment, which was clearly a long time coming and passed through all sorts of different possibilities. There was the Russian collusion story back in the day, and then there was the January 6th committee hearings, and then there was him taking classified documents out of the White House, remember that? But now we have the porn star instead. That's the hush money for the porn star. That's become the kind of focus of his indictment. So let's take a look at exactly what's happened here over the past, I guess you could say 5 years, or maybe more now. It's 6 or 7 years, to understand a little bit about the contemporary state of American politics. I have 3 topics there: the left out pioneers, the individual versus the establishment, and democracy. Well, we know the story, and one of the biggest political upsets in America or any country, Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016 over Hillary Clinton, achieving a decisive electoral college victory despite losing the popular vote. Now, you might wonder how that can happen. Well, that is due to the structure of the American political system, which is split according to different states. He never gained the majority in the popular vote. Never had it at any point during his presidency, because the highest he ever polled was 50%, and that was a kind of watershed for him. But typically his popularity would hover around the low 40s or early 30s. So he never had the support of the majority of Americans. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why his victory in 2016 was such a shock over a decidedly establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton, obviously the wife of former President Bill Clinton and someone heavily involved in the Obama administration. Seems fairly clear that much of MAGA country, that's the Make America Great Again country, is made up of self-styled descendants of the 19th century pioneering individual. Because we talk about this, we talk about Trump's support base, which doesn't seem to have budged an inch since 2015, I guess you could say, was when he started really rising in popularity. He has this vast support base, which accounts for a very significant number of people in America. I mean, we're talking millions of people. And the question has been asked repeatedly, who actually are these people? Well, there might be people who are just Republicans on principle, or who find expedient reasons to vote for Donald Trump. But the kind of adulation that is levered onto him, the sort of celebration of Trump himself, I mean, that's its own separate thing, with him holding these big rallies and having this fiercely loyal support base. Well, I would offer to you that many of these people are indeed this kind of descendant, or a self-styled descendant, of a particular version of the individual in American culture. This is a point I mentioned previously. When we go back and look at what we mean when we say the individual American citizen, well, there's all sorts of different ways you can define that person, but so much of the American national ethos owes something to the 19th century and to this idea of the pioneering heritage in America. The notion that the real American individual is the independent person who is formed, cultivated, far away from institutional centers of power. So in other words, not someone who works for the government, not a wealthy, privileged person, but rather someone who is just the self-made individual, someone who goes out there onto the pioneer with the axe and hacks down trees and builds their own cabin and just lives independently. And that whole idea, Frederick Jackson Turner's idea, that this is really the heart of American democracy. As I said previously, I showed you this slide before, you have a depiction, a picture of this individual as a kind of cowboy figure, someone who works out there on the prairie or on the range and is basically away from institutional centers of power and authority. From the start, this was always a particular construct of the American individual, which rests on intersectional identity. We have particular markers of identity. You would expect this to be a white American, because this construct of the American pioneering individual was in opposition to Native Americans and African Americans. This became the construct of the free American person, in opposition to African Americans who were enslaved in the 19th century, or many of whom were enslaved, and Native Americans who were not fitting within the parameters of the American project. Gender, male, because it would be men who are actually the cowboy figures, and also those who are gaining increasing democratic rights under the Jacksonian democracy, for instance. Sexuality, straight, hypermasculine, and I mentioned the kind of ambiguity of class, almost classless individuals in many respects. I would say that it's this kind of version of the American individual, America as being directed at this particular version of the self. These are the people who have felt left out of the development of America for the last 30 or 40 years. And it's not as though their views are entirely unjustified, because there really is this notion that the American top 10%, which, as I say, is basically structured around all sorts of different factors. But we talked about the American education system, these elite brand name schools, those kinds of institutions. The entire top 10% is not made for these people. I mean, these people stand outside of the upper echelons of American society and culture. And probably for a whole lot of them, that has the feel of being on another planet or something. I mean, Harvard or Silicon Valley or even Wall Street, I mean, it's just another world, right? It has nothing to do with their lives. So they're certainly shut out from a kind of the structures of the hierarchical structures of American affluence and wealth at the very top end. But so too with the decline of American manufacturing, the loss of the American manufacturing base, which I mentioned has been exported to a high degree to various other countries, specifically China, but other countries as well. There's just been a decline in the American factory worker, a decline in the entire structure of the American working class over the last 30 or 40 years. And you could also say that the general political rhetoric of America as well, which takes into account things like intersectional identity and points out systematic persecution on the basis of things like race, gender, sexuality, various other factors as well. The rhetoric of America has certainly moved away from these people as well. And consequently, they start to feel invisible or left out of the American project when they are supposed to be the embodiments, the personifications of the American project. And thus they find a very interesting messiah in Donald Trump. This is the very bizarre aspect of Trumpism, the way that MAGA country flocks to him, and there are all these individuals who seem precisely as this rebel or outsider figure to the establishment, someone who speaks to them directly. Now, this, of course, is really an ultimate irony because there's nothing about Trump that actually connects to the lives or the backgrounds of people in MAGA country. I mean, at least not the majority of them, right? Trump is not this kind of salt of the earth person from a small town in America whose father worked in the coal mines. He comes from this kind of, modest background. I mean, no, that's not Donald Trump at all. I mean, he's from New York. He inherited this real estate company from his father. So he had, right from the start, privileges, advantages, attended an Ivy League university. And then you look at what he represents. He represents all the different pillars of the American establishment, all the pillars of the upper echelons, the wealthy and powerful echelons of American culture. He was this real estate tycoon, this real estate mogul who became a multi-billionaire, and he built these luxury condos. He built various resorts and golf clubs and all sorts of different things, all sorts of different places and settings that are designed to keep people like MAGA supporters out, right? I mean, Trump Tower is not designed for the common American working Joe blue-collar person. Absolutely not. No, it's for the richest people you can possibly find. So too with his golf clubs and his country clubs. I mean, they're hyper-exclusive places. I mean, the only thing he really built for common people were casinos, right? Which are designed to fleece common people. So he clearly, his entire trajectory across his career just takes him through that pathway into the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, as it might be. And later on, he also represents the popular entertainment industry, the culture industry in America with his reality TV show, The Apprentice. That's just another version of the American establishment. It's the Hollywood establishment. It's the movie stars or the people who make it big as singers, as musicians, a whole different variety of people. Again, in many cases, millionaires, perhaps even billionaires, as the case might be. And Trump is someone who entered into that world, and that was crucial to him becoming more and more of a known individual, a known commodity. So you bring this all together. Trump is this kind of embodiment of a particular version of the American establishment. Okay, so why would people who might be descendants of an American pioneering individual, why would they be drawn to Donald Trump? Well, I think the reality is he might simply be the human face of the establishment. It does seem to be the case that the establishment in America, and here if you talk about the political establishment, has become increasingly faceless. It's become more and more walled out in these glossy skyscrapers or these kinds of private enclosures or these gated communities, or maybe just sealed up in Washington. There's this feeling, I think, of a kind of inaccessibility, the sense of the American establishment as being far removed from ordinary people's lives, but also just this kind of army of different drones that are churned out regularly, who just basically spout the same rhetoric, promulgate the same ideas and beliefs year after year, and none of it actually makes a difference. None of it actually produces new jobs. None of it actually produces growing equality in the United States. It's just this scripted exchange. Sort of like what I said before, the idea that American politics has blurred the boundaries between politicians and actors, or between real debates, real dialogues, and just scripted exchanges, between politics in general and reality TV shows. The idea that everything is choreographed, everything follows this set pattern, and there's no real individual back there, no real person addressing us. So along comes Trump, and he describes himself as this rebel, this outsider, and you can see that this is actually what he believes. He's not just putting it on for political purposes. He's always described himself as an outsider. In what sense? Well, definitely not in the things that he does. Definitely not in the career that he's had. I mean, he's definitely an insider in every sense of the term. No, it's in the things he says. That's basically what makes him an outsider. And we saw that over and over again during his presidency, during debates on Twitter. It's this kind of boorish, vulgar, bigoted, off the cuff, just sort of say whatever comes to his mind personality. I mean, that's how he sees himself, as being this outsider. In terms of the actual Trump presidency, in terms of his actual policies, I mean, they were typical Republican policies. I mean, there wasn't really anything earth-shattering or anything really unique. But you did have this person there who was always causing turmoil through this ridiculous outspokenness and this kind of behavior, which was so against the grain of what people would expect from an establishment politician. And he connected with people. It was purely the rhetoric, purely the language, purely the voice, purely the things that he says, as opposed to the things that he does. Then the 2020 election, here's another point that I've touched upon previously. This is just after the election. Time magazine described, quote, the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election, detailing how labor groups and corporate America came together to protect the workings of democracy in the 2020 election. A point that I mentioned previously, the kind of revenge of the establishment, so to speak. The idea of this kind of alliance between those who work in labor groups and corporate America, so Wall Street, and also the entertainment industry as well, because that was certainly the prevailing narrative in the lead up to 2020 from various actors and musicians using their platforms to speak out about the election. You could also include social media there as part of that network, especially social media curbing certain stories or repressing certain stories, all in the interest of kicking Donald Trump out of the White House. All of these different forces came together to protect the 2020 election. What they wanted to do, of course, was to have a more accurate result in the 2020 election. Because as I said, the kind of irony of the whole thing was that Trump was elected in 2016, even though he never had popular support. And this was due to the structure of the Electoral College, but it was also due to voter suppression and the fact that not enough people came out to vote in 2016, which kind of skewed the results. So in the lead up to 2020, you have a an aggressive campaign to eliminate voter suppression, to build up a distance mail-in ballot campaign. Of course, COVID was a part of that as well, and also the workings of the different political dialogues and narratives to combat Trump's various theories about how the election was rigged. So you could say that the establishment came together in 2020 to produce a more accurate result, but here's the kind of story there. The secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. Real democracies do not use secret shadow campaigns, right? That's the kind of subtext there, is that democracy is supposed to be transparent and open. The very fact that there has to be this kind of hidden network of different forces, establishment forces working in America to ensure a certain result comes about in 2020, it's like an admission of defeat. It's like saying that American democracy is not actually functioning right now. It is not actually producing accurate, valid results at the polls. Thus, we have to pull as many strings as possible in the background to try and bring about a fair result, which is also a favorable result as well. Not only that, but here's another point I mentioned previously. This kind of campaign that worked in the background was surely working on behalf of Joe Biden as the establishment candidate, not someone like Bernie Sanders, for instance. I mean, I guarantee this kind of network that belongs to the American establishment, it was already in motion probably during the Democrat Party primaries. And those people who, again, occupy, say, the top 10% or even less than that, the top 5%, top 1% of American society, they don't want Bernie Sanders. They don't want him as a president. They don't want someone who talks about socialism, who talks about completely revolutionizing the healthcare system, someone who speaks about free education. Do you think that those people want Bernie Sanders? Absolutely not. They would much rather have the prolongation of the status quo. Thus, we end up with Joe Biden as president of the US, someone who barely even seemed to run a campaign in 2020, who was effectively parachuted into the presidency and is clearly today just this stock figure occupying that role. The individual versus the establishment. I mean, this remains the kind of narrative that winds its way through contemporary American politics. As I said, the paradox of Donald Trump becoming the individual. He was kind of blown up to those dimensions, but what he ultimately represented was a kind of repackaging of Republican Party ideology, because once he's in power, he just basically follows the Republican Party line. And so too today. If he were to become president again in 2024, I'm not going to speak about that. I'm not going to speak about things that are still, thankfully, in the future, such as American elections. But if he were, then his policies as president would just follow the typical Republican playbook. They would not be radically different from that. There's almost this question of where do we even locate the individual in contemporary politics? Has the individual become such a fraught construct, such a kind of a dire sort of idea within contemporary American culture that we struggle to even locate this person? Return to the idea of intersectionality. Individuality is not just a single category or a single demographic. It is a cross-section of all sorts of different positions, different categories that the person could occupy, some of which can be malleable and flexible. These are different intersecting identity positions that come together into a single person. But I think we have the impression today with contemporary American politics that we just see demographics. We just see the classification and categorization of larger groups of people, larger swaths of people into this particular racial group, this gender group, this sexual orientation group, this class group. And it's almost as though the idea of the individual as belonging to multiple positions is just completely lost in that. So we've come to the end, and the last thing I want to leave you with is an idea that I brought up previously about creative democracy. There you see John Dewey and Anna Julia Cooper, two individuals who were born almost in the same year, and also who lived for a very long time, both of them, exponents of creative democracy. And here is the principle, the idea that we have to take into account moving forward. The decay of the workings of the system of democracy is one thing, but we also have to think about the personal experience of democracy. People like Dewey and Cooper advocated this simple concept. The democracy is not just something that is enshrined in a constitution. It is not just a name for a particular kind of political system that works through elections. It is not even something that refers specifically to individual rights or freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech. No, democracy is a lived personal experience, a cultural experience. It's the kind of thing that is woven into someone's day-to-day life, and it begins with how they experience their communities and their society. The individual has to believe that they are actually living in a democracy. And this, I think, opens the way to a consideration of the state of American politics today. How many American people really do believe that they're living in a full-fledged democracy right now in the 2020s? How many people actually believe that idea? I would say that it has been shrinking steadily over time. This is something for people who live all over the world to take into account, because I happen to agree with the idea that democracy is the best political system that we have at our disposal. But again, there isn't just one version of democracy. It doesn't just involve one particular institutional authority. It is as diverse as a particular individual's experiences of the world. I think that is worth protecting and thinking about in the future. So that is the class, American Cultural History. Be thinking about, of course, the final exam, study for the final exam, and take into account, of course, material from the previous 4 classes. And if I don't see you again after the exam, enjoy the time off, enjoy your summers, and I hope to see some of you in my classes in the future.